ideas, and thanks, Eli, for sharing them with you.
Hi, everybody. It's always hard to go after Ethan because he's so amazing, and he does look like a sort of better-looking Ben Franklin. So it's hard act to follow. But might as well just cut to the chase. We're all living a lie. Some of us may be living more than one lie, but I want to focus on one in particular that I think, has been in the conversation this whole day. And it's a lie we all kind of know intellectually, but I think it's hard to unlearn. And you can even kind of see it in some of the founding documents of our government. It's here. We hold these truths to be self-evident. So there it is, the idea that truths are self-evident, right? And this has kind of been baked into us in a certain way from the very beginning. And goes with this other kind of mythology, which is that there's this marketplace of ideas, and that the best truths in a marketplace will rise to the top. So, 1 year and change into the Trump administration, I think we can say safely, like, the truth is not rising. And to the contrary, it's actually, being stepped on, it's being watered down. It is not doing the job that we need it to do in a democracy. And I think, as Barack Obama said in his kind of farewell address, like, this is a crisis. This is a threat to the very principle of this government, because, as you all know, as practitioners, like, you can't have a democracy without some way of servicing what's true and getting to some kind of agreement on it and finding a way to then make good decisions about it. But I think I'm going to offer a different perspective on the cause of this, because I think, we've all talked a lot about fake news and we've talked about disinformation, but I want to suggest that actually the challenge that we have, the problem that we have, is different. It's a bigger problem, which is that you could take away all of the Russian bots and still face this truth that the truth isn't loud enough. Our systems for getting the truth in front of the population in order to actually make good decisions, like, they're just not working well enough, and you could put all of the kind of fake news stuff aside and still have this problem. And it's getting worse. And so this actually isn't a bum-out talk, I promise, but I want to suggest that in order to solve this problem, we have to understand, why isn't it working? Why is the marketplace of ideas rigged? And then what can we do to unrig it? And I actually think there's an extraordinary opportunity that's in front of all of us, and particularly the people in this room, to do just that. But I think first we have to kind of unpack, what is the challenge that we're facing? So I come at this from kind of a bunch of different perspectives. As Vince said, I kind of started out as an activist running Move On. I then wrote a book, The Filter Bubble, which was sort of looking at how social media changes what gets seen and not seen, and what impacts that might have for democracy. And then I started a company, Upworthy, that's now part of Good Media Group, that was trying to kind of play with, well, how might you solve that? And so I want to kind of bring all of that together to talk about what I've learned about sort of what's going on. But let's actually start with a basic question, which is, what does democracy need from media? And I think, I'm going to offer 5 answers. There's probably more, but we all start with this one, which is we need informed citizens. We need people to know what the facts are, and this is important. And then we might go to accountability. We need media in order to hold truth, to hold power to account, and take down, bad doers in government. If we were kind of stretching a little further, we might say, well, actually, a big purpose of media is to build empathy, because as you live in a very, in a society with lots of different cultures, how do you actually come together if you don't understand what other people's lives are like, if you don't understand, how do you make good decisions on behalf of the whole if you don't know what the whole looks like? And so media needs to help build empathy. And then I want to add 2 that are sort of less often in the conversation. So one is representation, which is that often when we talk about media, we talk about it kind of like from the facts down to the people. But actually, I think, as Ethan described, often actually a critical role is the opposite way. When Ethan was talking about, sort of first came the newspaper and then came the political party, like often media actually helps people see themselves as a community, see themselves in the conversation, voice concerns that wouldn't be heard otherwise. And so we have to kind of think about it not just as a flow down, but as a flow up as well. And certainly Breitbart has, I think, in a weird way, demonstrated how powerful that is, because I think more important than any kind of like information that was flowing through Breitbart was the sense of like, yeah, white nationalism is a thing now, it's a community, and we're relevant on a national stage. And that was a really important message, albeit for a terrible group of people. And then the last one, I think, is that we can sometimes forget just how fundamental to democratic practice media is. So one of my favorite things that I've heard about recently was a study by a guy named Matt Genskow, who's a Stanford economist. And it turns out that when TV turned on in the 1950s, it turned on in different media markets at different times. And what that provided was this kind of natural experiment where you could go back and look at what happened to voting patterns when TV turned on in a market. Now remember that, at this time, TV didn't have any local news. It was just a national network. And so what you saw was, TV would light up and voting, and especially local voting, would go way down. And this was just a very predictable pattern that happened everywhere that TV rolled out. And so part of that was it was actually stealing time from civic activities. And part of it was that when people moved to TV, they were spending more attention on national news. They were spending less attention on local news because it wasn't part of the conversation on TV. And as a result, they were less involved in politics. So there's this very real way in which it's not kind of like just about the information that we have. It's about like, do we remember to exercise our muscles as citizens if we don't have a media that's actually drawing attention to these things? So if you kind of put these things together, I want to suggest that these are some of the jobs that media does for democracy. And then that there's kind of three pillars that allow media to do those jobs. And those pillars basically are attention, trust, and money, right? And what I want to suggest is that we're living through a time where each of those pillars of this three-legged stool has been destabilized. And that we have to kind of think about how that destabilization has happened before we think about how we can kind of build, I wish I had a more inspiring metaphor than a stool, but build a new three-legged thing that will support this necessary thing for democracy. So let's start with the money and the economics. And we all kind of know this story about the internet coming along, but I want to suggest, a particular way in which I think we haven't given it enough thought. So we all remember, in the 1970s, you might have a local TV station. It reaches a certain perimeter geographically. Anyone who's in that perimeter gets that content for free. There's a small subset of people who actually are sort of monetizable in our modern lingo, and that advertisers actually want to reach, but you have to actually go to everyone in order to find those people. And so as a result, you have these kind of beneficial inefficiencies where you're providing content to a whole bunch of people who are essentially like not worth much, but they get it anyway because you don't know how to discriminate between those two groups of people. So, as Ethan referred to, this is kind of often described as a golden age of political informedness, and there were ways in which it did mean that a lot of the population had to be exposed to a certain amount of kind of political content, whether they wanted to or not, simply because at 6 p.m., if you wanted to watch sports or you wanted to watch cartoons or whatever, too bad, the news is on, and you would watch that. And there just wasn't a lot of choice. So, obviously, this was not a golden age in many respects, and there were a whole bunch of people who never got to speak at all through this kind of economic model. And, but it did kind of create a certain sense of kind of, okay, everybody's watching the same news. So along comes the internet. And one of the things that technology does most powerfully is it makes things more efficient. It makes markets more efficient, right? And it's worth spending a moment thinking, okay, if Airbnb makes the housing market more efficient, and if Uber makes the taxi market more efficient, and if Facebook, what does Facebook make more efficient? What's the market that is making more efficient, right? And the answer is it's making more efficient the selling of valuable attention to advertisers, right? but emphasis on valuable attention. Because, essentially what's happened is that all of a sudden now we can find those few people who advertisers wanted to talk to in the first place and just speak to them. So this is sort of the dirty secret when we talk about an attention economy. I think we don't talk enough about the fact that some people's attention is more valuable than other people's attention. And this has consequences in what kind of media gets built in this kind of media economy, right? So one of these consequences is that rural attention isn't as valuable as urban attention. And we're all kind of living through this massive collapse of local media that's in large part driven by the fact that the economic models that used to exist simply don't. But part of that is kind of a judgment on, well, those people just don't actually buy expensive goods and the things that the advertisers want to target in the way that people in an urban area will. But I want to suggest that this isn't just a geographic problem. It's also a demographic problem. So I did a Facebook experiment just to kind of illustrate this, where I took the same ad and I ran it against two different groups of people. One was a group of wealthy, college-educated coastal men, and another group was a group of low-income Latino women. And you can see the men were worth, it cost $6.59 to reach the men, and it cost $1.23 to reach the women. Now, if this is true, is it any surprise that there are a whole host of media outlets that are targeted toward and providing all sorts of news information for those old white dudes, and not a lot of new growing digital entities that are focused on young Latino women, even though that's a large and growing part of the population. And so I think what we're seeing, driven by all of this, is this kind of rising information inequality, where the economics have shifted, and they mean that even to the extent that media was viable that would subsidize everybody getting spoken to in a certain way or engaged in a certain way, that's now becoming a kind of narrow-casted thing. And so we get this kind of eating away of the fabric of media and the growth of news deserts. So money goes away, and now let's talk about trust. So a lot of people talk about trust in terms of, can I believe what media was saying? Can I believe the facts? And I want to look at this a slightly different way, which is I want to suggest that this is actually about warmth beating competence in the war for trust. So what do I mean by that? If you talk to Trump voters, one of the things they say is like, yeah, he lies, but they're honest lies. And if you get past the well, what does that even mean? There's something really important there, which is that when you talk to social psychologists about trust, there's two components to trust. And one of the components is competence, and the other is warmth. And the warmth component is incredibly important. We don't trust people who are competent and cold. And so I think we can forget that actually, as human beings, the first question that we have about anyone, and there's actually some new research coming out of the University of Texas showing that this applies specifically to media, is what is your motivation and what is your intent toward me? Are we on the same team? Are we on different teams? Do you care about my interests? Do you not care about my interests? And that question comes before I assess, well, are you going to be good at serving my interests if I think I can trust you in the first place? And so we now have, I think it's easy to make this mistake because we've lived through this era where we had these local media monopolies, and one of the criteria for being able to speak to a large audience was that you had to subscribe to a certain set of journalistic norms. And so we allowed ourselves to imagine that people trusted those norms. But they never trusted the norms. It was just the only way that they could get access to an audience. And so we now look at this big crash in trust that was described earlier and wonder, where is it coming from? My argument is it was always there. It was sort of artificially high because media never had to work very hard to show warmth. And now I can get news from my friends. I can get news from partisan outlets that I know have my best interests at heart. I don't need to get news from people who I don't know what they feel toward me. And therefore, I'm going to do that. It's easier, and it's more sort of human in a certain way, or is more natural for humans to do. So this point that trust is about who has your best interests at heart. And I think people reasonably look at the media and say, well, you don't have my best interests at heart. You're selling me out to advertisers. You're writing only about very small parts of the country and very small groups of the population. You don't care about me. That's true in a certain way. And unless you address that problem, I think it's very hard to resurrect this trust piece of the puzzle. So the last piece is this attention piece, and I think a lot of the morning, we've been talking about this. But I just want to suggest, and we all kind of know this, that civic media just isn't great at fighting for attention. Like the media that is most important a lot of times just isn't used to having to do that. Because it used to be the case that it didn't need to compete. You just got on the front page of the Times, or you got at the top of the newscast, and you got out to a large group of people. So now those same stories that really matter are in the same Facebook newsfeed algorithm with some dude sledding off his roof and ending up in a dumpster. And people have to kind of choose which they want to engage with. And we haven't kind of adopted the craft mostly to this new environment where it actually is a head-to-head competition. And so obviously, this is something that I've thought a lot about at Upworthy, and one of the reasons that I started the company. And one of my favorite parts of my work at Upworthy is actually we have an in-house social science team where we get to actually do experiments. So one of the things we were looking at was what actually drives sharing anyway. And if you talk to people, mostly people talk about emotion. That strong emotions, anger, joy, pride, all of these things drive sharing. But when we looked at it, we found there was sort of something that was an even stronger predictor of sharing than emotion. And it was basically this quality of empowerment. So after I finish consuming a piece of content, to what degree do I feel like I'm part of this story? Do I feel some sense of control or agency in this story? Or to what degree do I feel passive? This was a stronger predictor of sharing than how emotional it was or which emotional valence it had. And I just want to suggest that for a lot of people who are creating civic media, this is not the frame through which we look at what people are left with at the end of the day. Do they feel engaged? And certainly if you pick your average climate science story, it's about as far from that as possible. People leave the story feeling like, well, there's this global phenomenon I can't do anything about, and it's getting worse. And that's hard to engage with. So if we need to fight for attention, I think empowerment is a great place to start. So we're living through this shift where a bunch of these kind of the legs that hold up the functions that we need democracy to serve have been kind of cut out from under us. And as I said, it's actually not a gloom and doom talk. I think we're actually living in the most exciting moment, kind of the reformation of civic media. And I think that you all in this room have a critical role to play in that. And but before I do that, let me just talk for one more minute about what we've learned at Upworthy, because the last 5 years of my life have been, in a way, trying to crack some pieces of this problem. So I think the good news from Upworthy is, I think we feel like, yeah, there is a really large audience that does want to engage with civic issues, that does want to engage with hard issues. We've had massively successful campaigns around public health and climate change and other things that sort of are boring and hard to engage people around. There is an audience that wants to do that. And it's large, and you can actually, in some cases, build a sustainable business off of it and make an impact. And we've been able to measure that in some cases. And so all of that is exciting, and I'm proud of that work. And at the same time, I look at what we've done and I say, is this the model for solving these problems? If we were to scale this up by 20 times, is that the right model? And I think there are important ways in which it's not. And so just to kind of get that out on the table, I don't think that if you're a VC-backed startup, then the market that you're serving is very important. We happen to serve mostly sort of millennial women, and that's a market that's that the advertisers want to reach. But as I just sort of described, there are a whole bunch of markets that aren't as monetizable, and that this model is not going to work to reach. Millennial white women, by the way, just to state it clearly. I think the second piece is it is true that as a business, even a mission-driven business, it is hard to carve out enough time to focus on impact. And I'm proud that we've held to our mission, but I also look at it and say we could have done a lot more if we hadn't had some of those constraints. And then I think the last piece is this piece of this isn't a solution for some of the most important audiences. So what is? I think the key piece that I'm trying to illustrate is if we're trying to solve a news desert problem, letting 1,000 flowers bloom is not going to work because flowers are going to bloom where the water already is. And the water is the economic circumstances that we're living in this new world. So we can't think in a purely kind of for-profit startup model if we want to solve this problem. So I think there's a space that is growing that is, this chart basically has sort of nonprofit on this side, profit-driven on this side, elite-focused on this side, where you see great kind of nonprofit, elite-focused stuff like the Marshall Project over here. And then I think there's this real space for what are the news nonprofits, the new news enterprises that are not focused on elites. And I think that's the place that we need to be looking and thinking. I think there's an extraordinary opportunity there. And 50 years ago, we confronted a bunch of the same kinds of problems. And if you look at the charter for the public media system, it's actually pretty great. It's in the public interest to encourage the development of programming that involves creative risks and that addresses the needs of unserved and underserved audiences, particularly children and minorities. Like, not a bad place to start. And so part of what I'm arguing is we need a new kind of digital public media system. And we need it to do three things. We need it to gather attention, so go where people are and make it empowering and engaging. We need it to actually earn people's trust by rooting for and serving their interests. And that's like easier said than done, but I think it's a critical piece of the puzzle. And we need it to be sustainable. And I look at something like the Texas Tribune, which has this kind of motto of mission fidelity, revenue promiscuity, which is to say, we're going to be partly funded by philanthropic dollars, we're going to do some kind of like civic events, and we're going to have some advertising. We're not going to be seeking to make a huge return, but we're going to try to build something that's just sustainable in a local ecosystem. So, I think what we should be looking for is this kind of new ecosystem and movement of community-focused, impact-oriented digital media channels and entities, and I think a network that can share learning capacity across these properties, because I think one of the exciting things here is if they're not sort of fast-growth, VC-driven media startups, then there is this possibility of opening up this real conversation about, like, well, how are we doing it? And I think that's a lot of what happens here. But I think there's a bigger scale that we could do this on. And I think if you're thinking about, well, this might cost a few $1 billion, like, yeah, it probably does cost a few $1 billion to build this. I know that's more than is in the room right now. But if you think in Zuck units, it's like fairly like small, 0.4 Zucks. And so in a way, it's a lot of money and it's not a lot of money. And in fact, what I want to suggest to you is, that money is actually coming. So what I want to suggest is that either from the platforms or from very wealthy individuals, there will be 9-figure and 10-figure investments in something like this in the next year or two. I could be wrong, but I'm just going to put it out there. So think about, that's an extraordinary and transformational opportunity. And it could all wash away. Like, a lot of you are funders. You know how easy it is to spend money and have no impact. It would be easy to spend a few $1 billion and have no impact. And I say that with love. But I think that's the opportunity, which is if we are bold and experimental and we can find the forms and point to the problems that we think are most critical, then actually there is a way to get to scale right now. But people actually don't know what the form of the thing looks like enough to know what to scale up. And so I think that's the project that's incredibly exciting at this moment in time in the media ecosystem, is I think there's a will, there's a way, and the question is, well, what are we actually going to do, and what form does it take, and what are the successful, shapes that it's going to look like to build this new infrastructure. And that might mean something like the Voice of San Diego, which is this innovative new digital news thing. It's not a newspaper, but it's a news site in San Diego that has a bunch of kind of values-driven principles behind it. It might be actually sort of repurposing things from existing organizations. So you look at what the National Domestic Workers Alliance is doing with this new podcast called, I think, Sunstorm, which is basically like the view for domestic workers. And that's really interesting. Like, that's a very powerful new way to reach an audience that's underserved digitally with both, engaging content and critically, civically important information. So there's a lot of opportunity out there. And I guess I'll just close by saying, like, we know that the truth is not going to distribute itself. And we know that what we have right now is not working. And this is just a critical moment. And it's a big moment not just for media or not just for America, but I actually think, like, for the whole project of democracy. Like, I think people around the world are trying to figure out, like, does this system where people get to decide what their government does work, or does it not work? And I think that's what's going to be decided in the next, decade. And so we have an opportunity to shape that. And I'm so excited to be here with all of you and to be in that project with all of you. And I thank you for the work that you're doing to help make that happen. Thank you.